Hello everyone, Professor Wolf here. I'm making this video for students in my Old Testament class at College of DuPage in fall 2025. In this video, I will review most of the questions from the midterm exam for the class. Before I get to the questions, I'd like to address a few preliminary matters. First of all, some of you may be asking yourselves, why on earth would my professor give the class an exam and then go ahead and record a video in which he answers most of the questions from that exam? The answer is fairly simple and straightforward. Here it goes. I do not view the exams for this class as an opportunity to test your ability to memorize and regurgitate large blocks of information about the Old Testament. Instead, I view them as an opportunity for us to review some familiar information and to get familiar with some new information, some new ideas, some new questions, some new debates. I view it as a learning opportunity. In a way, sort of as an extra class. To be perfectly frank with you, I view the exams as a way to, extend the semester a little bit, or contact time, and, to bend your ear about some important, interesting material relating to the Bible. There it is. Do I expect that you will remember some facts, some basic information about the Old Testament and the Bible more generally as a result of engaging with these exams? Certainly. Of course. Yeah, of course. You will remember things. You will remember things. I think you'll remember quite a lot if you give the exams the attention that they deserve. But more than that, you will develop your critical thinking abilities, your general critical thinking abilities, and your critical thinking abilities specifically in application to the interpretation of the Old Testament, more generally the Bible, more generally religious texts, more generally texts, okay? You'll develop your ability to interpret well, and so, to work your way through scholarly debates and much more. And hopefully it'll also help you with your reading abilities, your writing abilities, information literacy abilities, and more. So there it is. All right, another thing, the scope of the exam. I want to make two remarks about this. So first of all, the midterm is going to address some general questions about the Old Testament, and sometimes we'll talk about the Christian Bible more broadly, which contains the Old Testament and the New Testament, okay? But we're going to focus largely on the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Okay, that's going to be our focus because those are the books we focused on so far in class. We're midway through the semester. We spent a lot of time on Genesis, a lot of time on Exodus, a lot of time on Leviticus, really a lot of time on Numbers. We're going to wrap up Deuteronomy quickly next week. We're gonna run through Joshua and Judges quickly, especially Joshua. Spend a little more time on Judges. Then we'll spend more time on the books of Samuel. We'll slow our pace a bit, more time on the books of Samuel, the books of Kings, a little bit on the books of Chronicles. We'll go through the prophets pretty quickly and then spend a little more time on the wisdom books. So the midterm exam is general Old Testament issues and the Torah. Final exam will concentrate on the books we cover in the second part of the term. One more comment about the scope of the exam before I move on. Students often ask, what do we do with the Old Testament today if we're Christians? You could ask this if you're a Jew. Muslim students are often interested in what does the Islamic tradition have to say about these books? What do they do with them as a Muslim? Those are great questions, important questions. I think another interesting question is, suppose we're not Jews, Christians, or Muslims. What do we get out of this? Is there anything for us in studying the Old Testament, the New Testament? Okay, history. Anything else? Great questions, wonderful questions. We've said a bit about them already in class. We'll definitely say more over the course of the term. I'm planning to record at least one video, if not two, on this question before the end of the term for all y'all. But as far as the midterm exam goes, and this is also true for the final exam, I don't really plan to address those questions in these exams. Okay, the focus will be more on basic facts, information, and you can problematize that because almost everything we call a basic fact has at least one asterisk after it. But also some larger questions, debates. Okay, so there it is. All right, let's get going, and we're gonna start with question number 1. What languages is the Old Testament written in? In what books are these languages found? All right. This question's actually a bit complicated because, as it turns out, as we've discussed in class and as we will review in this video, there's more than one Old Testament. Are we talking about the Jewish Old Testament, which Jews typically don't call the Old Testament, right? We'll get to that a little bit later in this video. Are we talking about the Protestant Old Testament, which is basically the Jewish Old Testament, though the books are arranged differently and that matters? Are we talking about the Orthodox Old Testament, Catholic Old Testament? Let's answer this from the perspective of the Jews and the Protestants. Okay. The Protestant Old Testament, again, Jews don't call it Old Testament. They use several names for it. One they use is Bible, right? Or you might call it Jewish Bible to distinguish it from the Christian Bible. All right. We'll go into some of the different names and some of this a little bit later in the video, as I mentioned. But let's take that Jewish Bible, that Protestant Old Testament. Again, same books but ordered differently, and again, the difference matters, as we'll get to. Let's answer this question for that conception, those conceptions of the Old Testament. How would we answer the question? Here's how we'd answer it. We'd say the Old Testament is almost entirely written in Hebrew, but there's also some Aramaic. Hebrew is a Semitic language. Aramaic is a Semitic language. We can find different stages of the history of ancient Hebrew in the Old Testament, different forms of the language. We'll just keep it simple. What do we find in the Old Testament? We find Hebrew and some Aramaic. Hebrew in every book of the Old Testament, sizable chunks of Aramaic in 2 books of the Old Testament. Those are Ezra and Daniel. And by the way, Daniel's a pretty important book for Christians, a pretty important book for the New Testament. Okay. We can also find some Aramaic words and phrases in other books of the Old Testament. So, for example, scholars argue that we can find just a smidgen in the book of Genesis, for example, which is really quite interesting. And it is significant, actually, that you would find it in Genesis. But we're not going to really go into that any further. We're just going to review. Taking the Old Testament, this is what you'd want to write down and make sure you have written down. Taking the Old Testament in the sense of the Protestant Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, these being the same books but ordered differently, and the order matters. Every book of the Old Testament contains Hebrew. The Old Testament is written predominantly in Hebrew. There is some significant Aramaic. The Aramaic is largely found in the books of Ezra and Daniel, but there are some words and phrases found outside of Ezra and Daniel. And actually, before we move on, I just want to add quickly, as I mentioned in class several times, scholars believe that Aramaic was Jesus' native language. And there are still some Aramaic speakers in the Middle East today. I believe they're all Christians. I could be wrong about that. I haven't looked that up, maybe ever. That's just an impression I've gotten from things I've read about Aramaic. But it used to be a quite diffuse language, quite widely spoken, but today very few Aramaic speakers left. All right, let's move on to question number 2. What books comprise the Torah or Pentateuch? Pentateuch is a Greek term meaning 5 scrolls, 5 books. It's another term for the Torah. What books comprise the Torah according to Jewish and Christian tradition? Who wrote these books? What is the root meaning of the word Torah in Hebrew? What common translation of Torah into English is contested by many scholars? Okay, I want to see you address all these sub-questions, all right? This is good practice for you. You're going to have to do this in your places of work and so forth often. So what are the 5 books? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy is what we commonly call them in English. There have been different terms for these books in Jewish tradition, Christian tradition. There it goes. And I'm not going to go into why we call them these things in this video. We've discussed that. Okay. All right, fine. I'll do it really quickly. Genesis means like origins, beginnings. Okay, Exodus is a departure, departing from Egypt. I always say we should have called that book Exodus/Sinai, because once they depart from Egypt, they go to Mount Sinai and form this covenant with God. And Exodus and Sinai are totally tied together. Exodus, I have also said in class several times, is arguably the most important book of the Old Testament for Jews, maybe even for Christians. So that's Genesis, Exodus. Leviticus is things relating to the Levites from which the priests are drawn. Numbers, named after the censuses. Deuteronomy is a repetition of the law, because Moses reviews all the law before God takes his life, before Israel crosses the River Jordan, which they do in the book of Joshua to enter the promised land, or really that part of the promised land. Okay. All right. According to Jewish and Christian tradition, who wrote these? Moses or God or both? I'm just going to leave it there. So what is the root meaning of the word Torah? Teaching, instruction, guidance. Okay. What is a contested translation in English? Law. It's still fairly common for both Jews and non-Jews to refer to these, to the word Torah as law. And okay, here's where things get a little bit complicated. The word Torah is used in a lot of different ways in Judaism. Quickly, think of all of what we often call the laws in the Old Testament. Another term that is commonly used in Judaism for them are the mitzvot. The singular is mitzvah, the plural is mitzvot. Again, as we talked about in class, Jews often speak of the 10 commandments. Jews speak of the 613 commandments, the 613 mitzvot. Those commandments are often called laws, and the commandments are a pretty big part of the books we call the Torah, because they're the charter for the Mosaic covenant, the Sinaitic covenant. Those 5 books are thus often called Torah. You could render, the 613 commandments. You could render that in English as 613 laws. When we use the word Torah for those books, you could call that the law, right? And in the New Testament, it'll sometimes speak of the law and the prophets, right? So there it is, right? In English, it's common for both Jews and non-Jews to render the word Torah as law, but really the root meaning is teaching, instruction, guidance, and there are both Jewish and Christian scholars that challenge the translation of law. Some really don't like it. Many say they don't like it because, well, they'll just say it's not really the most accurate translation. Many will also add that law often feels burdensome, onerous. You can also pronounce that word onerous, as it turns out. okay, these are two main reasons for not liking the translation. I have kind of a complex view on this topic, but I'll just leave it there and move on. Question number 3. Jews commonly divide the books of the Old Testament into 3 main sections, while Christians commonly divide them into 4. What are the divisions? So if you look at our class textbook, it's a Jewish study Bible, the JPS study Bible. You can see 3 main divisions: Torah, prophets, and writings, right? And another name for the Old Testament in Judaism is Tanakh. It's an acronym of the first sounds of Torah, Nevi'im, prophets, and Ketuvim, writings, right? You take those first sounds, string them together, you get Tanakh. Okay, it's another name for the Jewish Bible used by Jews. Okay, so 3 sections there. How do Christians standardly divide the books? Into 4. And what are the 4? Torah, history, wisdom, prophets. I'll say that again. Torah, history, wisdom, prophets. Okay? Jews put the prophets second. Christians put it fourth. They put it last. That matters. If you look at the last book of the Christian Old Testament, Malachi, you look at the very end of Malachi, it deals with the prophecy about God coming to Israel, setting things to rights. Okay? When Christians put Malachi last in their Old Testament, it sets things up very nicely for Jesus. Okay? The Jews place the writings last. The last of the writings are the books of Chronicles. The books of Chronicles, 2nd Chronicles, ends with King Cyrus of Persia ending the exile and sending the Israelites, who pretty soon, are going to be called the Jews, back to Judah, the southern part of Israel, to re-inhabit the lands and rebuild the temple. Right. And this is where we get the second temple. So the way that the Christians order the books, it sets things up very nicely for Jesus. Connects Jesus with Old Testament prophecies about God restoring Israel, visiting Israel, redeeming Israel. For Jews, ending as it does on this decree of King Cyrus, it emphasizes, this is a common interpretation, the Bible doesn't make this explicit, but common interpretation, it emphasizes that even though Israel has suffered this exile, which we really haven't talked about in class yet, but we will in due time, we'll spend a lot of time on it in the second half of the class, that even though Israel has suffered this exile, their exile is over and they have been reconciled and restored, and their covenant with God will continue. Their special relationship with God will continue. Okay. There it is. Now, it's worth pointing out that Jews have not always had this threefold division of Scripture, this tripartite division of Scripture. The Septuagint, which we'll talk about, an old Jewish translation of the Old Testament in the Greek, also had a fourfold division of the books. I believe that it was a little bit different from a division of Western Christians have been using for a long, long, long time. I believe in the Septuagint, it goes Torah, history, poetry, prophets, but there it is. Jews have, at least at some point in the past, also employed a fourfold division of the books of the Bible as I understand it. There's different Old Testaments out there, as we've talked about in class, and this we'll say a little more about in a moment. All right, question 4. Why do many scholars object to the name Old Testament? Why do some scholars object to the name Hebrew Bible? Okay, so much could be said about this. Let's try and be brief. For many, old sounds outdated. And there are both Jewish and non-Jewish scholars that have concerns about that for various reasons. I mean, first of all, for Jews, there's nothing outdated about the Old Testament. There is no New Testament. There's just really like the Testament, right? I mean, yes, you get the Talmud, the Talmuds, you get other rabbinic texts. Yes, yes, yes. But there is no new covenant that has come to in any way replace or supersede the old, the Mosaic covenant, the Sinaitic covenant. Okay. And really briefly, when we use these terms Old Testament, New Testament, what does testament mean? It comes from a Latin word testamentum. That's a translation of a Greek term for covenant. Really, what Old Testament, New Testament mean are Old Covenant, New Covenant. Now, we're going to talk about covenants more later in this video. As you already know from class, there are many covenants in the Old Testament. So what would it mean to call these books the Old Covenant? Shouldn't it be Old Covenants? Like, if it's signaling out one covenant in the title, what is it? Well, it's the Mosaic covenant. It's the Sinaitic covenant. All right, that's what it is. That's what it is. And by the way, you can find language about a new covenant in the Old Testament itself. For example, in Jeremiah chapter 31, I think it's verses 31 through 33, verses 31 through 34. I didn't review that stuff before the video, but you can find a reference to a new covenant already in the Old Testament that will be in the future, The way many Jews would view that, though, is when that new covenant comes, it's not that the old one is going to be set aside, or ended, but observed in a fuller way, perhaps. Okay. And actually, there have also been some Christians that have argued that old covenant, actually, that I shouldn't call it old here, that Mosaic covenant, Sinaitic covenant, will endure forever. I think you could see Paul say that in, Romans 13, that God's always going to maintain a special relationship with Israel. And now you can get into these questions about whether Paul thought that Jewish Christians should continue following the Jewish law, and if so, why, and all sorts of debates on it. It gets really complicated. But the thing is here is that you can find a number of covenants in the Old Testament. Okay. When we say Old Testament, New Testament, we really mean Old Covenant, New Covenant. Which Old Testament covenant are we singling out? The Mosaic covenant, the Sinaitic covenant. Okay. There's this concern that when we use the term Old Testament, that we're basically saying, well, we could be saying a lot of things. We could be saying all Jewish history is kind of unimportant. We could be saying that the Old Testament covenants, or maybe not all of them, because you have like the Noahide covenant, and you might not want to say this about the Abrahamic covenant or the Davidic covenant, but that this Mosaic covenant, Sinaitic covenant, that it is somehow over, that it is somehow passé. And there's a lot more that could be said about this, but in general, there's a concern that in calling those books the Old Testament, we're kind of saying that the whole history of Israel, that Mosaic covenant, that's all just passé, no longer has any application, so forth and so on. And that could even embody anti-Semitism and other concerning attitudes. On the other hand, it does get a bit complicated because the Old Testament itself talks about how there will be this new covenant. The New Testament itself talks about the new covenant comes with Jesus. We do find a number of parts in the New Testament, Mark 7, Acts 10, Galatians 2, where Jesus, God, and Paul, I'm not trying to imply that Jesus is not God. I'm just, I'm not trying to imply anti-Trinitarianism here. It's just, you understand what I mean. But basically say that at least some portions of that Mosaic covenant are non-binding on non-Jewish Christians, and maybe even non-binding on Jewish Christians. Okay, maybe non-binding on Jews, and so, and there's debates about all that. So it gets kind of complicated, right? I will just say my own view is, I don't think old has to mean passe or superannuated. I don't think old has to carry any kind of negative connotation at all. It could carry quite positive connotations. I mean, for a lot of cultures, like Indian culture, Roman culture, old was good. You did not want to be new, right? It's often said by, Hindu scholars of Hinduism that in Hinduism, in contrast with the West, Sanskritic thought, Sanskrit and Hindu texts are not just in Sanskrit, but, in like Hindu thought, the idea is knowledge is recovered. You got to go back to get the knowledge. Another term for Hinduism commonly used by Hindus is Sanatan Dharma, which means eternal law. Whereas for many people in the West, knowledge is discovered. Well, I mean, for Christians, I mean, maybe it's a bit of both, I think actually for all of us at the end of the day, it's some of both. I don't think old has to have any kind of pejorative or negative connotation whatsoever. But many scholars would say, hey, since Old Testament can have negative connotations, let's just say Hebrew Bible. Let's just use the term Hebrew Bible. But some of us also have problems with that. Number one, it's not fully accurate because it's not all in Hebrew, right? But beyond that, and this returns to an issue we addressed earlier, if you look at Orthodox Christians, at least many Orthodox Christians, their Old Testament is the Septuagint. And what is the Septuagint? There's a whole question on this later in this exam, but the Septuagint briefly was a pre-Christian, it was a Jewish translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew and Aramaic into Greek done before Jesus. The Torah being done about the middle of the 3rd century BCE, and the rest being done about the 2nd century BCE. A translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew and Aramaic into Greek. Now, by the way, the authors of the New Testament, who are writing mostly in Greek, a little bit of Aramaic, maybe even a little bit of Hebrew, outside of proper names from the Old Testament. There's a little bit of debate on that, whether some of this Aramaic in the New Testament should really be judged as Hebrew. But at any rate, the authors of the New Testament, when they're writing the New Testament and they're writing in Greek and they're quoting Scripture, alluding to Scripture, the Old Testament, which has maybe not all been canonized as such by that time, but at least a lot of those books are known and they're viewed as authoritative. Even if the concept of a canon, as we tend to think of it today, isn't fully in place, they're often looking to that Septuagint. They're looking to that Septuagint, right? That Greek translation of Hebrew Aramaic scriptures, into Greek, right? And for Orthodox Christians, their Old Testament is that Septuagint. And they don't have a desire to go back to the Hebrew original. The argument is often, if it was good enough for the authors of the New Testament, it's good enough for us. And being an Orthodox Christian myself, whenever I hear somebody say, let's just call it the Hebrew Bible, I mean, actually, as an Orthodox, I don't really get bent out of shape about things like this. But just as an historical point, it does occur to me, well, I'm not sure that's really the neutral, as neutral of a term as you think it is. I'm not sure is really neutral for many Christians today or many that lived in the past, including many of the church fathers that helped articulate the Christian faith in certain respects. So, and one thing I really haven't studied enough are, Catholic views of, of the Vulgate and history of the Vulgate, which was this Latin translation of the whole Bible, produced by Saint Jerome, and very important in the Catholic Church for centuries after, including up to the present day. So I don't know if calling it Hebrew Bible really, is all that neutral, given that the Old Testament is in Greek for Orthodox, and existed in Latin for Catholics, at least until very recently, and in still some sense today. It's my understanding. I need to learn. I need to study more of, the history of the Vulgate and those related issues in Catholicism. Anyhow, so that was a lot. Summarize that. Okay, part of critical thinking is summarize. All right, let's move on. Let's try and get through some stuff quickly. Okay, question number 5. Give the titles of 7 books that are found in Catholic and Orthodox versions of the Old Testament, but that are not found in a Protestant Old Testament or the Jewish Bible. Why did early Protestants argue these books should be removed from the Bible? What do scholars today make of these arguments? Finally, are any of the deuterocanonical apocryphal books of the Old Testament referenced positively by the authors of the New Testament? Okay, look, I realize this video is going to get really long. I'm going to officially truncate question number 5 right now. All I want from you is give the titles of 7 books found in Catholic and Orthodox versions of the Old Testament, but not in the Protestant Old Testament or the Jewish Bible. We will talk later about why these books got removed and related issues, how they show up or don't show up in the New Testament. Let's deal with all that later. All I want you to give me is the title of 7 of these books. What are they? Tobit, Judith, 1st, 2nd Maccabees, Wisdom, Sirach, and Baruch. Okay? That's all I need. Just give me the titles. We'll deal with the rest of the question later. Let's not overload things too much. 6, give the titles of 2 books that are found only in the Old Testament of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, Jubilees and 1st Enoch. Again, we could say more about that. We're just going to move on. We'll talk later about how it turned out. You've got different Old Testaments among Christians. Okay. All right, 7. Briefly, what was a covenant in the ancient Near East? In other words, what function or functions did covenants serve in ancient Near Eastern kingdoms, such as that of the Neo-Assyrian Empire? What function or functions do covenants serve in the Old Testament? So we talked about this in class a bit. Covenants are basically, they're often treaties. They're often treaties in the ancient Near East. They're often treaties. The first covenants that we know of in the ancient Near East, I mean, good grief, is it the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, like around 2500 BCE? I think they may go back that far. When we see these covenants appear, they're basically treaties between kings. Okay. In the Old Testament, scholars would say that a lot of times, even if it looks like the covenants are treaties, sometimes maybe a better translation is promise or even pledge. Maybe actually we shouldn't always be using the same translation. Maybe sometimes treaty is better. Maybe sometimes pledge is better. Maybe sometimes promise is better. But in general, what we see with covenants is there is some sort of promise, pledge, or treaty where you have 2 parties. It could be 2 individuals. It could be 2 kingdoms. It could be 2 communities within a kingdom. It could be God to a nation, God to an individual, God to an individual and their descendants, right? But you have two sides, 2 parties, and one or both sides pledge or promise something to the other. Sometimes there's an expectation, an explicit expectation articulated. Maybe sometimes not. Sometimes there are specific blessings promised if the other individual complies with the terms. Sometimes specific curses imposed if the person doesn't. Carrots and sticks. Okay. Let's move on. 8. What are the 4 main covenants of the Old? That should say Old Testament, not Old Covenant. What are the 4 main covenants of the Old Testament that we discussed in class? For each, explain who the parties were, what the terms were. In what sense is the relationship between faith and grace, Or what is the relationship between faith and grace in these covenants, and relatedly, what happens when the covenants are broken? Okay, oh boy, let's go kind of quickly. So again, you can find far more than 4 covenants in the Old Testament. The main 4, the 4 we highlighted in class, are the Noahide, the Abrahamic, the Mosaic or Sinaitic, and the Davidic. Noahide for Noah, Abrahamic for Abraham, Mosaic for Moses, also called Sinaitic for Mount Sinai, Davidic for David. Okay, who are the parties in the Noahide covenant? God on the one hand, and secondly, everything that came off Noah's Ark and their descendants. All human beings alive today, all birds alive today, all land animals alive today, not necessarily the fish. What did God expect from the animals? Nothing. From us, we talked about this in class. There's different interpretations of this. It's generally viewed as avoid idolatry, maybe uphold monotheism, that being tied with rejecting idolatry, and very basic morality. We'll leave it at that. It's a little more complicated than that, but we'll leave it at that. What does God promise to do? Not destroy the earth, or more specifically, not destroy it again by water. All right. Abrahamic covenant. Who are the parties? This gets a little bit tricky. God and Abraham, but by extension, you could see the whole nation of Israel being implicated. Some would see the whole human race being implicated, but you could say it's between God and Abraham, and by extension, all of Israel. And what does God promise? To make of Israel a great nation. He's old, doesn't have kids, wants kids. Sarah's old, doesn't have kids, they want kids. To make of him a great nation, many kids. To make up, basically, that's the nation of Israel. 2, to bless that nation. And 3, to bless the nations, bless other nations or curse other nations by Israel, right? This is often taken by Christians to mean that God is going to use Israel to save the whole world. Another interpretation, just more locally to the Torah, is God will bless those who are kind to the patriarchs, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and his sons, right? That God will be kind to those who are kind to them and not so kind to those that are unkind to them. All right. What conditions does God expect? None are really mentioned in Genesis 12, where these promises are first made. Genesis 15, God imposes an expectation of circumcision for the males. Seems that the Noahide expectations are enforced. Don't engage in idolatry, right? That's it. Mosaic covenant or Sinaitic covenant. Who are the parties? God and all of Israel. Where does it take place? Mount Sinai. What are the terms? The 613 mitzvot, the 613 commandments. If Israel agrees to keep the commandments and does, they will receive many, 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 many blessings. They'll hold on to the land. They'll be able to defeat any enemies who attack them. They'll live to a ripe old age. They'll have food, water, shelter. They'll have good lives, and God will dwell in their midst. And they'll be God's special people. Okay? If they agree to keep the commandments and they don't, God will curse them. The curses will be the inverses of the blessings. They'll resemble the plagues inflicted upon Egypt. God will murder most of them. Okay. And, take their land away. They'll go into exile. They'll lose their land. And a lot of them will just be dead. Okay. Davidic covenant. That God promises, this is in 2 Samuel. I always forget if it's 2 Samuel 6 or 2 Samuel 7. Can never remember that. One of those chapters, God promises David that he will establish his throne forever. He will ensure that a Davidite or a Davidite, a descendant of David, rules over the people of God forever. Any expectations? None are mentioned at first, but some are eventually added. Especially we see this in Kings, the books of Kings. God expects basic monotheism from the Davidic kings. And they don't make good on that expectation. And so God does eventually strip away 10 of the 12 tribes from their rule. Okay. All right. So skip the part about whether these are covenants of faith, covenants of grace, or both. I just really quickly, I think you could say they're both, and ultimately you could argue it's grace. But in the interest of time, let's shorten some stuff. We can get to the other stuff later. 9, Deuteronomy 28 contains the fullest statement of the blessings and curses of the Mosaic Sinaitic covenant found in the Old Testament. You also find some in Leviticus 26. Summarize these blessings and curses. How do the blessings and curses relate to one another? How do the curses relate to the plagues of Egypt? I just addressed all that in the last question, and you can go read Deuteronomy 28 for more. Question number 10, Deuteronomy 30 tells us that the Israelites will violate the Mosaic Sinaitic covenant. It predicts that. God will inflict the covenant curses on them as a result. Yep, and he does, according to the text. So what does the text say will happen to the Israelites after they've suffered the covenant curses? That God will redeem them. They'll turn back to him. The remnant will turn back. The survivors will turn back. God will redeem them. God will rescue them. That even though they will fail to comply with God's expectations and they will suffer the covenant curses, their relationship with God will remain intact, and he has espoused them forever. They can never be divorced. All right. 11. Numbers 25 tells us that God made a covenant with a particular Israelite man and his descendants. I shouldn't say and his descendants, actually. That's disputed. We'll see that in a moment. Who was this Israelite? What prompted God to make this covenant? The details of this covenant have been interpreted in several different ways. What are two? I mean, there's actually, I've seen three, but you only have to mention two. So really briefly, this is Numbers 25. And what happens here is that Israel is fraternizing with a foreign people, engaged in sexual relations with their women, and potentially going after their gods, committing idolatry. This is a betrayal of Yahweh, a betrayal of El Shaddai, a betrayal of the shield of Abraham. This is a betrayal of God. It dishonors him. It shows dishonor and disloyalty. You could think of the golden calf incident back in Exodus 32, right? Though this is in some ways even more intense. So Phinehas takes like a lance and impales this Israelite man who is sleeping with this foreign woman, having sex with this foreign woman. Phinehas slays them out of zeal for the honor of God. And for defending God's honor, God makes a covenant with him. The term covenant is used. I think it's a covenant of friendship is a term that is used, to be precise. So this would be a fifth covenant. And again, you could find many more. So who is Phinehas? Well, he's one of the sons of Aaron. Sorry, not son of Aaron. Son of Eleazar, son of Aaron. So let's go back. Aaron, brother of Moses, the first high priest. When he dies in Numbers 20, who succeeds him? Eleazar. Aaron actually has four sons: Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. You may recall in Leviticus 10, God kills Nadab and Abihu. This leaves two sons, Eleazar and Ithamar. Eleazar is the one who succeeds Aaron as high priest. Phinehas is his son. Okay? God makes a promise, a pledge, a covenant with Phinehas for having defended his honor. So what exactly is the covenant? Well, there's some debates about this. Some say that all God is really doing is reiterating that the sons of Aaron will be the source of the high priest without specifying which exact lineage. It's just really kind of saying that the high priest and the priests more generally will be descendants of Aaron without taking any stance on the particular lineage, right? That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is that God is making a promise with Phinehas and only Phinehas, saying, you will be high priest after your father Eleazar passes. Okay. Another interpretation is there's this really kind of complicated saga in the Old Testament that gets filled out in rabbinic literature because the Old Testament doesn't really go into a lot of detail about it. But it turns out that at a certain point, so remember, Aaron's got 4 sons, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Itamar. Again, God kills Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus 10. Eleazar takes over as high priest. His son Phinehas will become high priest. What happens to the line of Itamar, that 4th son of Aaron? Well, it turns out at a certain point, the sons of Itamar do become the high priests. But even later than that, the high priesthood does get transferred back to the line of Phinehas. We'll see this in the book of Kings, and it's rooted in some events in the books of Samuel. So there are folks who would say that the way we should interpret this prophecy in Numbers, this covenantal prophecy, the covenant pledge that God makes to Phinehas, is that even though the line of high priesthood will end up switching over to his brother Itamar, it will eventually return back to Phinehas himself. Those are the 3 interpretations. Okay. You only have to mention 2. Now, why would I include something like that? Well, it's just because I love the book of Numbers so much. But honestly, it's really just a way of underscoring that lineages really matter. I mean, what is it? 1 Chronicles 6. I mean, the first 9 chapters of Chronicles, it's a lot of genealogies, but 1 Chronicles 6 it's 66 verses, I believe. It's all the line of Levi. And we saw Numbers pays close attention to the line of Levi. It's concerned with censuses and, in a way, lineages of all the 12 tribes. But Levi really matters. The priesthood really matters. This stuff really matters to the biblical author. And I don't want us to always just stick with stuff that's comfortable to us. I want us to embrace things. Well, you have to, say embrace, but engage with things in the text that were important to the authors and first generations or readers, even if we're not always so compelling to us today. Let's put it that way. We don't want to, it makes total sense for modern people to ask, what do we make of the text today? But we want to be careful about just bending it all to our own interest and smoothing it all out for ourselves, right? Okay. So, all right. 12, where was question 12? Okay. I don't have a question 12, so sorry, I don't know what happened there. All right, let's move on to 13. Okay, if there's a 12 before the one I'm about to read, that one's off the exam. According to Genesis 11, where is Abraham originally from? How does Abraham respond when God calls him? How did Adam respond when God called him after he ate the forbidden fruit? Where is he originally from? According to Genesis 11, Ur of the Chaldees. We make it different responses in other parts of Scripture, but there it goes. How does Abraham respond when God calls him? Here I am. How did Adam respond when God called him? He hid. And you'll see other patriarchs respond, here I am. That matters. That is charged, pregnant with meaning. Okay. 14, create a family chart for the following individuals that indicate how they relate to one another. That's for you to do. 15, who is Esau? How is he related to the family of Abraham, to Ishmael? What nation is Esau the father of? So he's the son of Isaac and Rachel, the first son. Esau and Jacob are born at the same time, but Esau exits the womb a bit earlier, right? Actually, oh my goodness, I think I'm forgetting some detail here. I'm not trying to say this to boast in any way, but I want you to be confident in what your professor says. Like, I've read these texts a lot, but yeah, there was something kind of funny. Was it like Esau put his fist out first and he tied a string around? Okay, whatever. Esau's the firstborn. All right, go back to review exactly how that all worked out. So Esau's the firstborn, but he's not the child of the promise. The line of Israel really goes from Abraham to Isaac, skipping Ishmael, and whose mother was not Sarah, but Hagar. So it goes from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. It skips Ishmael. It skips Esau. Again, Ishmael was not born to Sarah. Esau is born to Rachel, but it skips. right? It skips. So, okay. What else here? Yeah, how's he related to the family of Abraham? Well, he's a son of Isaac, right? How's he related to Ishmael? He marries into Ishmael's line. Okay, so there seems to be a little bit of discrepancy actually in Genesis about this. We're told in Genesis 28, 6 through 9, that Esau went to Ishmael and took Mahalath, daughter of Ishmael, as a wife. We're told later in Genesis 36, 2 through 3, that he married Basemath, Esau's daughter. He marries into Ishmael's line. What nation is Esau? The father of the Edomites. The Edomites. Okay, 16. What is the tabernacle? What are its three main sections? Who's allowed in each of these sections? What are two ways in which the tabernacle is connected with Mount Sinai? How are the tabernacle and temple related? Okay, so the tabernacle, we went over this a lot in class. It's a portable sanctuary, the portable tent. Tents are typically portable, I guess. It's a portable sanctuary, a portable temple. It's basically a large tent. It's like a predecessor to the temple, but it's a tent that's portable. You can carry it around. There's three main sections. There is the courtyard, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. I'm just going to run through really quickly what these things contain. You don't have to write this down, but the outer courtyard, the courtyard has the altar for sacrifices and offerings and a laver, this washing basin, which Exodus 30, 17 through 21 says the priests have to use to wash before they go into the tent or make the sacrifices. The holy place, which is inside the tent, contains the table for the showbread, the lampstand, and the incense altar. Then there's a curtain separating the holy place from the Holy of Holies, in which is located the Ark of the Covenant. All right. You don't have to include what's in these places, but just to review that. The Holy of Holies is so holy because the Ark of the Covenant is there. That's where the name comes from. And the Ark of the Covenant is holy because God is present there in a special way. All right. So who's allowed in each of these parts? Anybody who's in a state of ritual purity, man, woman, priest, non-priest, can come into the courtyard. Who's allowed into the holy place? Only priests. Who's allowed in the Holy of Holies? Only the high priest. What are the connections with Mount Sinai? Here's two. 3 sections of the tabernacle, 3 sections of Mount Sinai. Also, Israel encounters God powerfully at Mount Sinai and encounters God in the tabernacle. 17, how are Aaron and Miriam related to one another and Moses? They're all brother and sister. 18, what clan of Levi do Aaron and Moses come from? According to the Torah, not all males in Levi serve as priests. Which ones serve as priests? What do the rest of the non-Levites do? So Aaron and Moses come from Kohath. The priests come from Kohath. Not all of Kohath, only the line of Aaron. You could see this in a number of places, right? There's a few different lineages in Kohath. The priests only come from the line of Aaron within Kohath, the Aaronites or the Aaronites, however you want to call them. We see this in a few different ways. You could go to 1 Chronicles 6 and look at that, the lineages for the clans of Levi. You can look at Korah's rebellion. In Numbers 16 shows this, okay? But there it is. Moses and Aaron from Kohath. The priests come not from all Kohath, but the line of Aaron within Kohath. What do the other Levites do? They serve and assist. The tabernacle, the temple, okay? 19, what are 3 different functions of the blood sacrifices and offerings of the Old Testament? What are the names of 3 different blood sacrifices and offerings? I'm going to give you a little bit more. So what are 3 different functions? So we covered this extensively in class. We have 2 different types of impurities, moral and ritual. Sacrifices can remove ritual impurity, function 1. They can remove moral impurity, function 2. And if we look at the well-being offering, according to Leviticus 7, we're given three functions of it, three potential functions. First, thanksgiving. Second, votive. That is the conclusion of a vow. And you might recall the Nazirite vow in number 6 concludes with sacrifices, okay? And also we are told in Leviticus 7 that a well-being offering could be a spontaneous or free will offering. What does that mean? Praise or love, just being spontaneously moved to give God something, right? I'd say this is praise or love. So removing moral impurities, removing ritual impurities, thanksgiving, expressing praise, love, or concluding a vow. All right. There's more functions out there, but there it is. What are the names of these? Well, Leviticus 1, we get burnt offerings. Leviticus 3, we're introduced to the well-being offering. We learn more about it in Leviticus 7. Leviticus 4 and 5, we get the purification reparation offerings that are connected with one another, various ways. You'll find different translations for some of these. As I mentioned in class, some of the Hebrew terms used for these sacrifices, we actually don't know exactly what they mean. And even sometimes where, well, I'll just say there's also occasions where the typical English terms, we're pretty sure don't reflect the Hebrew original or really very well. So you got to be really careful with this. I think this is actually one of the main places in the Old Testament where translation issues can really cause us some trouble. The names of those sacrifices. Some are okay, like whole burnt offering. I mean, that's not too far off of the Hebrew, but some of these other ones are a little more problematic. All right, 20. Leviticus 16 describes a series of rituals that are to be performed by the high priest on a specific day of the year. What are these rituals? What do you think that the function of these rituals might be? I'm going to let you do this on your own. You've got your study Bible, turn to Leviticus 16. Honestly, as long as you talk about this, the quote-unquote scapegoat ritual, that term scapegoat is not used in the Old Testament. I may have mentioned this in class. I've never confirmed this, but I've heard from several sources. Scapegoat was actually first used in English by William Tyndale in his translation of the New Testament. I'm not sure if that's true, but scapegoat, that term's not used in Leviticus 16. But at any rate, you could just describe the scapegoat ritual and leave it there. I'm fine with that. 21. In Numbers, why does God decree Israel must wander for 40 years in the desert before reaching the promised land? Because when those spies were sent out, in what was it, Numbers 13, Caleb and Joshua supported God, showed honor to God, and said that Israel could conquer the promised land with God's help. But the other spies said that the people who inhabited the lands were too big, too powerful, and they wouldn't be able to take them. And this is after Israel has complained many, 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 many times about how badly they wanted to be back in Egypt. And so God decrees that Exodus generation, the folks who left Exodus, who were adults in that, and who sided with these spies, and who despaired of God's ability to settle them in the promised land, help them win their wars, God decrees they have to wander the desert for 40 years till they all die. God does not strike them all with lightning bolts. I mean, if he did, number one, I mean, how would you care for the kids? Like all Israel would be gone at that point. But I don't know. Is that the reason why God spares them, or is it also just a mercy? Or I don't know. Is this also just supposed to be a pretty good punishment, like Cain the Wanderer? The text doesn't really clarify. But we are told that because of this doubt that they showed, they will have to wander the desert for 40 years until they die, and then it'll be their children who enter the promised land, except for Caleb and Joshua. They're able to enter the promised land. Even Aaron and Moses don't make it, but Caleb and Joshua do. All right, 22. What is the conquest? Where does it begin? In other words, what are the first kings that Israel defeats as part of the conquest? Where do these people live? In what book of the Torah do we see Israel defeat these kings? What does God command Israel to do to the people that they defeat in the conquest? So the conquest basically is this event that is supposed to happen that maybe doesn't quite take place, but it kind of does, kind of doesn't. The idea here is that God commands Israel to slaughter every man, woman, and child in the promised land. We talked about this in class, brief review. The promised land is Israel, the land of Israel. It's also often called the land of Canaan. Why? Because people live there called the Canaanites, okay? All kinds of references to them throughout the Torah. There'll be references to them in later books of the Old Testament, and there will be some interesting and important references to them in the New Testament, including in Gospels like Mark's, okay? You can think of the Syrophoenician woman, for example. There's some other things going on there. So the idea is that Abraham is not from Israel. He's from outside Israel. God calls him to Israel, brings him to Israel. Abraham spends time there. God promises him the land. He dies there. His son Isaac lives there and dies there, right? Then we get Jacob and his 12 sons, including Joseph. They all end up down in Egypt. Okay, they're in Egypt for over 400 years. Well, when they get freed from Egypt, where are they going to go? They're going to go back to the promised land. They're going to go back to Israel. Okay. Well, it's not empty. People are living there. Those are these Canaanites, which Leviticus tells us are very bad people. So it could just be Israel just settles alongside them, but it's already been telegraphed back in Genesis that, the land wasn't even big enough for Abraham and Lot, and it wasn't big enough for Israel when it wasn't even 70 people yet, and the locals in the land, maybe it's not that big of a place, and there's really more, I think, maybe relatedly, but more profoundly, the concern in the Torah seems to be that if Israel dwells among pagans, it'll become pagan, and that can't happen. So these people got to die. So God commands Israel to kill them, and he tells them, really, as long as Israel is confident that God will fight with them, then God will defeat their enemies, right? God will defeat their enemies, okay? You can think of Numbers 21. Israel, is harassed by this Canaanite king at the very beginning of Numbers 21. They tell God, well, if you're with us in battle, we'll kill them all. And God is with them and they kill them all, right? You can think of Numbers 31, when Israel, what do you want to call it, gets vengeance at God's calling on the Midianites for the incident back in Numbers 25 with Phinehas, which we talked about earlier. Israel puts together this force to slaughter all the men in the nation of Midian, and end up slaughtering all the non-virgin women as well. They report that not one man was lost, right? If they have faith and confidence, God will be with them and they will win their battles. Okay, so they're supposed to do this. Okay, where does this start? Where does the conquest start? So we talked about this in class. I think these details are actually really important. People will often tell you the conquest is in the book of Joshua. It's in the book of Joshua. It's in the book of Joshua. Not really so. It starts in Numbers 21. It doesn't start with that Canaanite king I just mentioned. It starts a little bit later in Numbers 21. It doesn't start with the Canaanite king because that's not really in the promised land proper, and they don't settle there, right? At least that's my understanding of it. When does the conquest really properly get underway in Numbers, and what are the kings that are involved? It is with our old friend Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan. And again, there are psalms that refer, and other passages of scripture that refer to God inflicting this, this defeat on Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan. That's the beginning of the conquest. Their lands will eventually be settled by some of the 12 tribes. Those people are east of the River Jordan. East of the River Jordan, that's the Transjordan. West of the River Jordan, or Cisjordan, that is the land that will be entered in Joshua. It's only in the book of Joshua they cross the River Jordan going west into Cisjordan. In Numbers, they're in Transjordan, east of the Jordan. All of the book of Deuteronomy takes place east of the Jordan. Aaron dies in Numbers 20 before they get into Transjordan in Numbers 21. Moses dies at the end of Deuteronomy. He never sets foot in Cisjordan, though he sees it from the mountaintop. Okay. 23, will Israel complete the conquest? Why or why not? So some passages in the book of Joshua seem to imply that they basically did complete the conquest or came awfully close. But other passages in Joshua are like they did not even come close. And it looks like they did not come close in the book of Judges or in 1 Samuel. No, they do not complete the conquest. That's the short answer. They do not complete it. Why? They didn't trust God. They didn't trust God that he would fight their wars for them. 24, why do Aaron and Moses die before reaching the promised land? What book of the Torah explains this? It's Numbers 20. Go back and look it up. 25, where does the book of Deuteronomy take place? The plains of Moab, east of the Jordan, Transjordan. All right. 26, what are 3 different meanings of the word Israel in the Old Testament? I'll give you 4. 1, the nation of Israel in the sense of the people. 2, the United Kingdom of Israel in the sense of the political entity. 3, at a certain point about the year 922, under Rehoboam, son of Solomon, grandson of David, who is king after Solomon, the United Kingdom of Israel splits into 2 kingdoms. We call them the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom. The Northern Kingdom is the Northern Kingdom of Israel. The Southern Kingdom is the Southern Kingdom of Judah. So there it is. And 4th, it's the name of Jacob after he wrestles with the angel, or God angel, however you want to take it. All right, we're getting close to the end. Let's do this. 27, what is textual criticism? Why is the textual criticism of the Old Testament considerably more complicated than the textual criticism of the New Testament? So textual criticism is basically that, I think I'm quoting here from Encyclopedia Britannica. I got some notes in front of me to make sure I cover everything I want to. It's the technique of restoring texts as nearly as possible to their original form. So basically, here's what happens, right? We have a lot of partial and complete manuscripts of the New Testament from the first few centuries after Jesus. It takes a while to start getting whole gospel books and then whole New Testaments, but by about, 1,000 years after the death of Jesus, we've got a lot of partial and complete manuscripts of the New Testament. When we look at them, we see a lot of discrepancies. There's a lot of inconsistencies. Why? Well, sometimes it's because scribes intentionally change things. Sometimes they did it on accident. So then the question becomes, well, how do you know what the original copy of Mark said, the original copy of Matthew, Luke, John, so forth and so on? That's textual criticism. It tries to figure that out. How do you do that? You look in manuscripts and other sources of information. There is a bit of a science to it, but also an art. There is interpretation to it, but that's what it is. Why is it textual criticism? And it's not just with the Bible we do this. We do this with the Quran. We do this with Homer. We do this with Plato. We do it with Shakespeare, right? We do it with Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, these great novels by James Joyce. We do this with all kinds of books because we get discrepancies with books, even books written recently. Okay? All right. Why is the textual criticism of the Old Testament considerably more complicated than the textual criticism of the New? We have far fewer manuscripts, far fewer. And they tend to be, to date, the earliest ones we have of the Old Testament tend to date long after those books were originally finished. Whereas with the New Testament, we start getting at least partial manuscripts pretty early. And it doesn't take too long before we get, complete manuscripts of the Gospels, letters of Paul, stuff like that. There it is. And ultimately, it's about the age of the text and the manuscripts. All right, 28. What is the Septuagint? Why is it significant to the textual criticism of the Old Testament? We talked about the Septuagint. It's the earliest known Greek translation of the Old Testament, translation of the Old Testament into Greek done by Jews before the time of Jesus. Again, a lot of scholars say the Torah is done by about the middle of the 3rd century BCE, before Jesus, about 250 years before Jesus. The rest of the Old Testament's translated about, the following century. That's what it is. The name Septuagint, by the way, comes from the Latin word for 70, because according to various legends, there were 72 translators of this text. We're not going to get into the legends. Why is it significant to the textual criticism of the Old Testament? Let me be really brief. When you look at the Septuagint and you look at the Hebrew Aramaic version of the Old Testament, there's some pretty significant differences, okay? Pretty significant differences. Not everywhere. Not everywhere. But there are some. There's a pretty substantial length difference, for example, in some of the books. Okay. And we'll talk about some of this more in class as the semester rolls on and we come to those books. All right. But when you see that there are these differences between the Septuagint and, let's just call it the Hebrew Bible, well, you ask yourself, well, what happened? And one view might be, well, the Greek translators added a bunch of stuff or left stuff out, or vice versa, right? Or vice versa. And there was this tendency, and still is this tendency, among a lot of Western Christians to assume that the Hebrew Bible that we have today must reflect the original manuscripts, versions, much more closely or more faithfully than the Septuagint. Actually, it's more complicated than that. I'd say good critical scholars who really study this think there's really good evidence to believe that sometimes actually the Septuagint is reflecting a more original source text than we find in our current version of the Hebrew Bible. But that sometimes the Hebrew Bible might be more original. So you'll get, for example, a lot of Protestants who will want to insist that wherever these two texts depart, the Septuagint translators monkeyed with the text somehow. Orthodox Christians like myself will often want to argue that no, the Septuagint was, was more faithful to the original on every count. I think good critical scholars actually argue it's a mix of both. It's a mix of both. All right, but it is helpful to us. The Septuagint is helpful to us in trying to reconstruct what might have been the original. But I could add that some scholars actually do think that some books of the Old Testament might have been originally written in Greek. There's one or two scholars that say that about Ecclesiastes, for example. I don't know about that, right? Some would say that there's some debates, because of the Aramaic in Daniel about whether those chapters, at least, or all of Daniel was originally written in Aramaic. Let's not get into that. Let's just talk about the books of the Hebrew Bible basically having been originally written in Hebrew and leave aside those kind of complexities. It does seem like the Septuagint in some places, even though it is departing from the Hebrew Bible as we know, is reflecting Hebrew originals that are closer to the source than what we've got, or at least that they were older. At least that the Septuagint the translators were sometimes working from older versions that we don't have otherwise, right? Or it might be reflected in other ancient texts as well, but anyhow, it is what it is. And I realize, I really just don't want to get too into the weeds on this. All I'm going to say is that, and just throw out one last thing, something that even some Renaissance humanists figured out. The oldest manuscripts are not actually always let me take it back. If you have two manuscripts of a text A and B, and A is older than B, that doesn't always guarantee that A is actually more faithful to the original than B. So that actually complicates this whole thing too. But safest way to put it, at least sometimes the Septuagint is reflecting an older Hebrew version than the ones that we're familiar with. Sometimes the Hebrew version we're familiar with is arguably reflecting older versions of the text. So, okay. 29, what is the Masoretic text? Why is it significant to the textual criticism of the Old Testament? Okay, so here's how this goes. If you look at the Old Testament that Protestants are working with today, if you look at the Jewish Bible, Hebrew with Aramaic, what are our oldest manuscripts of that? Well, until we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, our oldest manuscripts were the Masoretic text. How old is the Masoretic text? It started maybe about the 6th century, finished about maybe the 10th century. I mean, it's about 1,000 years old, let's just say, right? In the if you go back in time, the late 1800s, before the early 1900s, before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest version we had of the Hebrew Bible was a Masoretic text. It's about 1,000 years old, done by these Masoretes. Masorete just means tradition in Hebrew, but it's basically Jewish scholars who worked to put this thing together, about 1,000 years old. Okay. Why is that significant to textual criticism? Well, because for a long time, it was the oldest version of the Old Testament that we had, the Hebrew version that we had. So it was our oldest manuscript of the Hebrew. It's obviously going to be relevant to trying to reconstruct the Hebrew original. All right. So 30, we are really close to being done. I think this is actually our last real question. Thank goodness we're at 75 minutes now, 76 minutes. What are the Dead Sea Scrolls? Why are they significant to the textual criticism of the Old Testament? So Dead Sea Scrolls, many, many scrolls, hundreds of scrolls. First ones discovered in 1947, more discoveries in a decade, maybe 2 decades, maybe more following. I haven't actually looked too much at the history of all of that. Found in various caves. Okay, there's debates about who produced these scrolls. Many scholars would say it was this group called the Essenes. I'm not going to go into them now, though they're very interesting. Some scholars say other groups. Honestly, the Encyclopedia Britannica article is not a bad place to start with this, honestly. Or for the Masoretic text or for the Septuagint, honestly. I can get you more resources on this stuff too. And there's some information about all this in our study Bibles in the notes. So what is on these scrolls? Well, not all books of the Bible, but there were a lot of books of the Bible. A lot of books of the Bible on these scrolls, right? And when were these scrolls produced? They're produced before Jesus, actually about the time the Septuagint is being done. 3rd, 2nd centuries BCE is when scholars believe a lot of these Dead Sea Scrolls are being copied, being written. Okay, and these are in Hebrew, with Aramaic and relevant texts. And so why are these so important to Old Testament textual criticism? Well, think about it, right? Go back to 1946. Say you're a Christian, or you're a scholar interested in Christianity, or just, I don't know, just a layperson interested in Christianity, whatever. And you learn about these discrepancies in the manuscripts of the New Testament texts. And you're like, well, that's really interesting. How did those happen? How many discrepancies are there? And then you start wondering, well, what was the original text? And can we work it out, and how? Well, you got a lot of manuscripts to work with when it comes to the New Testament. What would you have had but then suppose you turn your sights on the Old Testament and said, well, what about the Old Testament? What text do you have? Well, for Hebrew, Hebrew Old Testament, all you really have is the Masoretic text. You do also have the Septuagint. You don't have a lot else. There were actually some other things, but I don't know how well studied they really were at that point. When you find those Dead Sea Scrolls, that is huge. Because if the Masoretic text starts about, let's say, 6th century and finishes around the 10th century, maybe a lot of it isn't done until about 1,000 years ago, and the Dead Sea Scrolls are from before the time of Jesus, now your oldest Hebrew manuscripts, substantive Hebrew manuscripts, not just a little bit of Hebrew on an amulet or something, which we've had, but like substantive manuscripts, they go back now over 1,000 years than your oldest ones did for centuries. That's a pretty big deal. And what are you going to do? What are you going to do the second you realize that these Dead Sea Scrolls contain Hebrew manuscripts, oftentimes multiple manuscripts of various books of the Old Testament? Well, you're going to want to compare them with the Hebrew text you're currently working from, the Masoretic. You're going to want to compare them with the Septuagint and anything else you got. And you're going to want to compare them with one another. And what do you find? Often they disagree with one another. Even the scrolls, the copies of these Old Testament books that this Essene, if it really was an Essene community, had, their own copies of these biblical books often contain significant differences among them. And at least on a number of occasions, they seem to favor the Septuagint. But in other cases, maybe not. And there may be cases, too, where neither the Septuagint nor the Masoretic text is favored, but maybe they kind of both, kind of got it wrong a bit. Really, really, really fascinating stuff trying to work out all of this, right? And just one final thought I'll leave you with. This is conjecture, but if this Essene community, or whatever it was, had copies of Old Testament books, sometimes multiple copies of the same book with some significant discrepancies between those copies, but they kept all the copies and didn't just keep one copy and burn the others, can we infer anything from that? Can we infer that maybe they didn't view these books as being as strictly defined by their exact words as we do? That they were more tolerant of discrepancies in manuscripts? Or is that a bridge too far? We got to be careful here of our conjectures and our speculation, but it does at least raise some really interesting questions. And I'm not going to say anything more about that here. We're 81 minutes in. So thanks for hanging in there. Hope you found this useful and educational. I'll see you in class. Good night.